Thank you all for the kind invitation to speak with you today. The Northern Arizona Applied Linguistics program has actually been very influential in my own development since I was a Georgia State alum, and 3 of my faculty at Georgia State were trained at Northern Arizona. And of course, I've also used corpus techniques and things like that in my work, and thus drawn greatly on many of the scholars here. So I'm super excited to get to talk with you all about this work that has actually also taken place at Northern Arizona. Especially, I have to give a big shout out to Occam Kang and her work in this area, which will be featured in this talk. Without further ado, I'm going to get right into talking to you about confronting language privilege in communication across linguistic difference. So right off the bat, I'm going to talk a little bit about this term privilege, which can be a bit controversial and definitely is often misunderstood. Privilege is an important concept in critical social theory, but it's found its way into popular discourse where it has become quite controversial and, I would argue, intentionally misunderstood often. In order to understand the concept of privilege, we have to start by understanding and acknowledging that human-made systems and institutions are inherently biased towards certain types of people in all kinds of ways. When we do this in the abstract, it's pretty simple to do. We can always see ways in which some people benefit and some people don't by rules and other aspects of our society. Because of these inherent biases, unearned benefits accrue to those who the system is biased toward, and others must deal with undeserved penalties as a result of these biases. Privilege, therefore, refers to the unearned benefits and status that membership in a particular favored group, bestows. Privilege is thus a function of your group membership and the related societal or institutional arrangements. It's not really a description of your individual actions or beliefs. As long as you're a member of a privileged group, you cannot escape privilege. Nor did you really choose it, of course. And privilege thus shapes your experience and ideas about the world in very important ways. So we often talk about privilege with respect to race, class, gender, and sexuality, and perhaps different forms of ability, but we talk less explicitly about privilege related to language, although it's an important element in the background of much of the work carried out in applied linguistics. In a blog post I wrote in 2013, I unpacked some of the privileges that native speakers of English, such as myself, enjoy. This includes things like easier access to international politics, travel, entertainment, and education, as well as a protection from the consequences of gatekeepers' negative language-related stereotypes. In other words, when I speak, because I'm a native English speaker, most people are focused on the message of what I am saying, and I am not facing the consequences of negative stereotypes about my language to the extent that other folks are. I'll be focusing especially on the language privilege of native English speakers, who I argue enjoy the highest level of language privilege of anyone in the world. So, a note on some of the terminology that I'm going to use. Like many applied linguists, I continue to struggle to come up with terms to refer to a very important social construct in my work, which has not always been adequately or appropriately theorized. I'm going to use both of the following sets of terms to refer to different linguistic groups today: L1 and L2 English users, as well as native and non-native English users. I'm trying to use the word users here to avoid saying speakers, since writing is also, of course, important. And also, if I say speakers, I'm potentially leaving out the deaf community. I'll use the terms L1 and native interchangeably in this talk. I'll also use the terms L2 and non-native interchangeably in the talk. These terms are contested, and the categories have been critiqued repeatedly in applied linguistics and in other fields. I want to note importantly that both of these terms are best understood not as descriptions of, or not as rigorous descriptions of linguistic repertoires, but rather as socially constructed categories. By saying that they're socially constructed, what I'm saying is that they are categories that are relevant in our lives because of the way they are discussed and disseminated in society, not because they offer rigorous and scientifically valid descriptions of distinct linguistic repertoires. In the social sciences and humanities, we recognize that socially constructed categories such as race, gender, and ability have material consequences for people as a result of the way society orients to these categories, and especially the members of stigmatized groups, even if these categorizations are questionable as descriptions of their linguistic repertoires. For example, in their 2001 article, Brut Griffler and Samimi argue that the participants in their study are deemed non-native speakers as a result of institutional sorting processes that attend not only to language production, but other information such as nationality and race. Such institutional categorization has important consequences on the professional lives of the participants in their work. So what does this concept of language privilege have to do with applied linguistics? Applied linguistics is many things to many people, but one of the most popular and prominent strands has been scholars who aim to help people integrate into institutions and communities by learning a new language or a new language variety. This is reflected in our deep commitments to language education. Over the past few decades, quite a bit of work has been carried out by applied linguists working to help non-native users of English integrate into Anglophone universities and academic disciplines. This work is often carried out under the label English for academic purposes, and indeed I don't really need to tell Northern Arizona applied linguists about this because you all have contributed greatly to this area of research, especially through your corpus linguistics research of academic English. I argue that we see language privilege show up in this work, however, in who we choose to make the focus of our mission to make communication in linguistically diverse spaces more successful. Here on the slide, I've taken a quote from Carmen Perez Yantada and John Swales describing English for academic purposes. EAP education involves the teaching, learning of specialized linguistic knowledge and literacy skills and aims at training university students and early career researchers professionally and making them successful communicators in English in academic and research settings. Specialized EAP education is particularly prominent today as English has become the predominant international lingua franca of higher education and research. The number of international students in tertiary education institutions is increasing, and the ratio of non-Anglophone and Anglophone scholars participating on the world stage is 4-to-1. The need to learn how to communicate in English in global academia is unprecedented. I want to point out that the beginning of this description does not seem to make reference to helping particular language groups, or university students and early career researchers could be anyone. And indeed, that certainly would be me. I'm an early career researcher. And John Swales' work has actually been helpful to me as a native English speaker who wanted to understand the genres of academic literacy better. I know that I've learned a lot about academic writing from looking at his books and also from teaching classes involving his scholarship. Yet, as the authors continue describing English for academic purposes and narrowing in on its unique role, they suddenly insert references to language categories such as Anglophone scholars and non-Anglophone scholars, or international students, which in the context of US higher education can be thought of as a language category. An important question to ask then is, who are we constructing as needing our help? Who are we constructing as having a problem? And I would argue that our answer to these questions reveals some of our disciplinary biases. From my perspective, this question, who are we constructing as needing our help, forces us to consider that applied linguistics has largely framed the success of communication across linguistic difference as determined primarily by the language produced by L2 users. An assertion that I argue is not based on established fact or evidence, but rather is an assumption that we make about the way the world does, or even more so, the way it should work. In a 2017 article, I discussed research about international teaching assistants in the applied linguistics literature, and I wrote the following. Our work seems to reflect the language privilege that native English speakers have, compelling us to focus on non-native English speakers as problematic communicators while ignoring the ways native English speakers communicate in linguistically diverse spaces. And I argue that this shows up very subtly in things like methodological choices that we make. So here's an example of the kind of research that is common in applied linguistics, especially experimental studies of language development around pronunciation. So in the upper right corner, you see a rather common questionnaire item. This is taken from a very famous study by Murray Monroe and Tracy Derwing. And this kind of approach has been used in a lot of applied linguistics research that explores pronunciation. The question is intended to measure the construct of comprehensibility, and the measure of comprehensibility is assumed to apply to the speaker. So in this paradigm, the researchers record non-native speakers and play the recordings for listeners, who are usually native speakers of English, although they also often include non-native listeners as well. They ask the listeners to answer questions about their experience of the speech they heard. For example, how easy to understand did you find the speaker? The listener then marks the scale with a rating that they believe best captures their experience trying to understand what they heard. The advantage of this procedure is that it allows us to get multiple listeners' ratings of the same speech, and thus to not be simply basing our impressions on one rater. Researchers average different listeners' ratings to provide a comprehensibility score to the non-native speaker or to the non-native speech sample, which they can then use as a variable in their statistical models. It's important to note, however, that this methodological procedure assumes a priori that communication problems between the non-native speaker and the native listener are primarily attributable to the non-native speaker's speech properties. The method is designed only to consider this part of the communicative process. It excludes from consideration issues such as whether the native listener uses cooperative strategies to repair communication difficulty. And indeed, as I will argue later, this is a highly relevant question for communication across linguistic difference. So in general then, I argue that applied linguistics as a field is complicit in reproducing the privilege of native English speakers in Anglophone institutions of higher education, such as myself. As scholars such as Rajadurai and Rajagopalan have pointed out, we do so through our choices of theories of communication and our associated methods that frame communication across linguistic difference as largely unidirectional. We saw this with the previous slide, where I described a methodological approach for studying comprehensibility, where communication seemed to hinge only on what the speaker did. In addition, I argue that we have advocated primarily for certain types of intervention, namely language support for non-native speakers. We have much more rarely advocated for institutions to directly confront the language privilege of native speakers of English and the way their privilege impacts communication across linguistic difference. What I'm calling for then is a reversal to this trend. I want us to develop a line of research in applied linguistics that specifically looks at who benefits from language privilege, how their privilege impacts communication across linguistic difference, as well as interventions to address the problems that their privilege creates in linguistically diverse spaces, which is what I will be focusing on here in this talk. So in 2016, Stephanie Lindemann, my PhD advisor, and I published an article in Applied Linguistics that lays out some early priorities for work that seeks to address how native English speakers impact communication across linguistic difference. We pointed to 3 areas where research has already suggested that native English speakers negatively impact communication across linguistic difference. We also reviewed the existing studies that attempted to address these concerns. The 3 areas we identified were language attitudes or ideologies, familiarity with non-native Englishes, and cooperative communication strategies. Next, I'm going to describe how this work connects to the notion of language privilege. Then I will give you an overview of each of these areas, as well as some updated information on the literature that's been published since our article was first written. One of the relevant aspects of native English speakers' privilege is the ways in which many native English speakers, especially those in places with strong monolingual orientations, like the United States, are able to avoid frequent contact with non-native speakers of English. While this allows them to remain in their linguistic comfort zone, we might expect that it would have the undesired effect of preventing them from developing familiarity with linguistic diversity, with other Englishes, and honing their skills in communicating across linguistic difference. We can point to a variety of studies in applied linguistics that have findings that would support this idea. For example, Beth Shepard, Nancy Elliott, and Melissa Bazeberg published a study in 2017 examining university instructors who either worked quite a bit with international students or who commonly who uncommonly worked with international students. So especially those who commonly worked with international students were the English for academic purposes instructors. They found that these English for academic purposes instructors were more accurately able to transcribe non-native speech in some of the samples that they played. And this suggests that EAP instructors have developed, through their experience and perhaps also their professional training, competencies that allow them to make sense of a greater variety of non-native speech than their counterparts. Their colleagues in other departments often reported less experience communicating across linguistic difference, and some of these faculty reported negative attitudes towards non-native speech. Negative attitudes toward non-native speech in this study was found to correlate with perceptions of how easy it was to understand the speaker. So you can see how these attitudes and these forms of privilege end up directly impacting some of the variables that applied linguists are particularly interested in. In general, I argue that native English speaker privilege is often associated with a lack of experience communicating across linguistic difference, and this in turn suggests that many native English speakers have not fully developed skills that would help them communicate across linguistic difference. Another feature of native English speakers' privilege is their socialization into ideologies that place the communicative burden on their non-native speaker interlocutors. In other words, native English speakers are encouraged by their socialization to view communication with non-native speakers as inherently problematic because of the other person's non-nativeness, and thus to blame the non-native speaker when difficulties arise. Such ideologies encourage native English speakers not to put in the necessary effort to successfully communicate across linguistic difference. Rather, they're encouraged to reject, ignore, avoid, or problematize non-native interlocutors. Stephanie Lindemann has shown in one of her articles that negative expectations about non-native speakers are sometimes associated with unproductive or disrespectful communication strategies that lead to difficulties in completing shared tasks and negative perceptions of the communicative experience. Okay, so there's a vast research literature employing many different methods to explore attitudes and ideologies about language. And in general, this literature points to widespread negative attitudes towards any speech that is perceived to diverge from a privileged native norm. This is particularly true of settings where a standard language ideology is in operation. And the United States is certainly such a place. The ways in which people evaluate others' language is also intimately connected with other ways in which we categorize each other, such as race. Nelson Flores and Jonathan Rosa have put forth the concept of ratio-linguistic ideology that posits that perceptions of language are in many ways connected to perceptions of race. In general, these attitudes and ideologies have a negative impact on native English speakers' ability to communicate with non-native speakers. Such attitudes have been found to correlate with diminished comprehension, unproductive communication strategies, and avoidance of non-native speakers. So it's clear that negative attitudes toward non-native Englishes are common amongst native English speakers. How then do we go about changing their attitudes? In our 2016 article, we put forth two general approaches from the social psychology literature on attitude change. These are perspective taking and structured content. I'll first address perspective taking. Perspective taking refers to approaches to attitude change that invite the participants to imagine the world from another's vantage point. In this way, the intervention is designed to encourage empathy or to create a sense of connection or shared experience with the other. This has been a common approach in applied linguistics work. One of the most common ways of doing this has been to instruct people in ways that language often differs, or English often differs when spoken by people with different linguistic backgrounds. So that is the approach, for example, one of the approaches taken by Lindemann et al. In this Lindemann et al. 2016 study. That's the same slide. Okay, so for example, another study that I could point to as an example is the study by Uttara Manohar and Ose Apya. They presented students with a video of an international teaching assistant telling the story of two negative experiences she had encountered in the classroom that were related to her speech. The researchers asked some of the participants, so undergraduate students, to take the ITA's perspective and imagine how she felt during these situations. Those who took the ITA's perspective reported greater willingness to support ITAs following this intervention than their peers did. So the idea being here that taking the perspective of the ITA forced some of these presumably native English-speaking students to consider their emotional well-being, the emotional well-being of the ITAs, as well as other things that might be going on for this person. The second intervention type that has been used to promote positive language attitudes among native English speakers involves structured contact. Structured contact derives from Allport's theory of intergroup contact, which proposes that prejudice can be reduced via contact between groups when certain conditions are met. These conditions include things like eliminating power differentials and ensuring a pleasant and cooperative experience. Structured contact has been found to be effective in a couple of interventions. For example, Occam Kang, Don Rubin, and Stephanie Lindemann invited undergraduates at a US university to interact with 2 international teaching assistants and to work together to solve a puzzle in groups. The contact resulted in the native English-speaking students rating international teaching assistants more positively in terms of their teaching competence than a control group who did not participate in structured contact did. As I've already noted, part of native English speakers' privilege involves a tendency to place themselves in relatively homogeneous spaces and to avoid the need to communicate across linguistic difference. This means that we are less familiar with Englishes other than our own. This also suggests a need for methods to introduce us to unfamiliar Englishes. In our 2016 paper, Stephanie Lindemann and I introduced 2 general approaches to this, an implicit approach and an explicit approach. First, I'll describe the implicit approach. In this approach, researchers present native English listeners with a collection of speech samples recorded by different non-native speakers. They provide a training program for the listeners to hear and practice their understanding while also receiving feedback to help them improve. In our 2016 publication, we wrote the following about the possibilities of the implicit approach. The results of several studies suggest that exposure to L2 English coupled with a task such as transcribing a sentence and receiving feedback afterwards improves L1 English listeners' word recognition in sentential contexts. In particular, participants who hear multiple L2 speakers during a training consisting of around 100 to 200 sentences demonstrate transcription accuracy rates that are around 5 to 10% higher than participants in control groups. Several studies have been published since our review of the literature was published, and these also generally support this conclusion, although they add additional insight into this literature. So I wanted to update this a little bit here. So the literature in this area has begun to provide some important information on 2 key questions that are still in need of further research. First, we need to know more about how durable the effects of these implicit training programs really are. What we tend to see are post-tests that are given immediately after training or maybe a day or 2 later. In Bieber and Gordon-Salant, 2017, the researchers gave a retention test 7 to 10 days after training was completed, and they found that the improvement in transcription accuracy that they had observed earlier seemed to disappear. However, they also noted that measures of cognitive effort suggested that the participants did retain some benefit of the training in that they seemed to find the processing of non-native speech to be easier. Intriguingly, Shi et al. Have also found that participants who were allowed to sleep before their post-tests performed better than those who were not, thus suggesting that sleep may play a role in consolidating the benefits of implicit training. Also of great importance are questions about how specific or general the training materials really need to be. In a really interesting study, Bezeberg et al. Showed that implicit training on multiple accents led to improved transcription accuracy even when participants were tested on a new non-native accent they had not been trained on at all. This would suggest that perceptual adaptation can generalize much more than we previously thought. However, Alexander and Nygaard reported that in comparison to accent-specific training, their mixed accent training was less effective. the trade-offs of these different approaches definitely need to be considered in further research. The other approach to familiarizing native English listeners with unfamiliar Englishes is the one we call the explicit approach in our 2016 paper. This approach involves presenting participants with information about other Englishes. It's almost like they're taking a mini linguistics course on variation in linguistics, or variation in Englishes. The effectiveness of this approach is questionable. In most studies, it is not proven to be effective at helping participants better understand non-native speech. Although in one study published by Stephanie Lindemann and her colleagues, including me, it was reported to be effective. We argued in that paper that the difference might lie in the fact that we tested the participants to make sure that they had understood the content of the training, whereas other studies had not done that in the past. Although less promising and less researched than the implicit approach, there is some potential value to the explicit approach still, in that it may serve as a linguistically oriented form of perspective taking, helping participants understand the origins of language variation. And Tracy Derwing and her colleagues, who published a study in this area in the early 2000s, found that it did not seem to have the effect of helping the native listeners understand the non-native speakers better, but they did find that they did report better attitudes towards non-native speakers. So this kind of approach might actually resemble in many ways perspective taking, which I've already discussed. So the third and final area that we point to in our 2016 article is collaborative communication strategies. We argue that native English speakers do not always use collaborative communication strategies in communication across linguistic difference, and that this often leads to further communication difficulties or makes communication difficulties that could be repaired quickly in conversation become much bigger problems. For example, some scholars have pointed to native English speakers' use of avoidance, meaning that rather than negotiating meaning when communication becomes difficult, native English speakers often feign understanding or simply remove themselves from the situation, thus avoiding communication and potentially creating more serious problems. In addition, many native English speakers also use strategies that subtly imply that their interlocutor's language is problematic. Finally, they've also been observed to struggle to effectively accommodate L2 English speakers, meaning they struggle to come up with strategies for making their speech more easily understood by L2 English users. Despite these reports across different literatures, there has not, to my knowledge, been any published research looking directly at collaborative strategies and how we might promote their use by those who are privileged by their status as native English speakers. And this brings me to the final part of this talk, where I'll give you a sneak peek of a forthcoming study that seeks to address some of the gaps in this area. So my colleagues and I are working on putting out a publication from a training program that we've been developing. So I'll give you a snapshot of this. We are looking specifically at US undergraduate students who hold language privilege and their preparation to communicate across linguistic difference with their international faculty and teaching assistants. So I want to acknowledge my co-authors in this effort, Stephanie Lindemann at Georgia State, Kris Acheson at Purdue, and Maxi-Ann Campbell at Duke Kunshan University. So we have three main goals for this project. First, and perhaps the most important goal here, is we want to move away from the one-off studies that have characterized this literature in the past. So a lot of the studies from the past have been interventions where a researcher has gone into a single classroom and held an intervention one time, or where a researcher has run these interventions in a laboratory. We wanted to create a model that could be adopted into existing curricula and perhaps become something that spreads much further. So we wanted to create a longer and more varied program that focused not just on one of these elements, but on all of the areas where native English speakers may have limited skill or competency. And finally, since there is no available research exploring the process of learning to use collaborative communication strategies, we wanted to focus our attention on this element for our research. So our reporting of results focusing on the strategy, our reporting of results will focus on the strategy aspect, but our intervention actually combined insights from all three areas that we discussed in our original review. So the context of this study is a large university in the Midwest United States. It was a computer science department at this university, which is a very large department at the university. It has many undergraduate and graduate students, as well as faculty, and reflecting general trends in computer science and other science and technology areas, many of those faculty and many of those graduate students are not originally from the United States, but are instead from India, China, and a handful of other countries. Most of these students and faculty are users of a variety of English that is stigmatized by the local language ideologies that the students arrive at the campus with. The computer science department received complaints from undergraduate students that they could not understand the lectures they attended from non-native speakers of English. And as a result, the department reached out to one of my colleagues, Kris Acheson, to ask if she would help them develop trainings for their international teaching assistants so that they could become better communicators. My colleague, Kris, countered their proposal by showing them research, such as what I've presented to you here, that suggests that these complaints may be a reflection of unaddressed language privilege, and that a more effective strategy would be to address the students' own contributions to communication in their linguistically diverse classrooms, especially for those students who benefit from the privilege of being seen as native English speakers. The department agreed to implement this intervention in a class that is taken by most first-year majors in the department. The class is designed to prepare the students for their academic lives in the department, as well as for later success in careers in technology. We felt that discussing communication across linguistic difference and language privilege would fit nicely into this course, as the students often find themselves studying in a more linguistically diverse space than they had previously encountered. And indeed, when they graduate and go on to work in the technology industry, it's likely that they will come into contact with people who speak English differently than they do. So we implemented an intervention in all 9 sections of the course offered during a recent semester. There were over 300 students who participated in some form of the intervention. And we focus here on data from those students whose responses suggested that they benefit from language privilege. So the students who categorized themselves as from the United States and first language speakers of English. In all, there were 174 such students who gave us complete data. So a little bit more about our intervention before I get into some of the findings. We wanted to design an intervention that would incorporate elements of all 3 of the areas that Stephanie Lindemann and I discussed in our 2016 literature review. So this is addressing negative language attitudes, increasing familiarity with non-native Englishes, and encouraging people to use productive and respectable communicative strategies. In the end, we created a 2-hour intervention. The first hour was completed online by the students individually outside of class, and the second hour was completed in person as a class. So here's a more detailed breakdown of the online portion of the intervention. The participants first took a pretest to get a sense of how they would respond to different scenarios of communication difficulty with a non-native English-speaking instructor. They then listened to 3 different lectures. Each lecture was paired with different types of activities. For the first lecture, they heard me talking about the realities of multilingualism and linguistic diversity in the world and recommending a cooperative approach to communication across linguistic difference. They then answered 2 reflection questions. Next, they heard a lecture from Stephanie Lindemann, who explained why people speak English with different accents. It includes information about features of specific L2 English accents, and that section also included a quiz testing whether the students had understood the information that they were presented with. The third lecture was from Maxi-Ann Campbell, who discussed 2 varieties of English, Chinese and Indian Englishes. Her lecture explains that both are heterogeneous, but that some common features can be observed. So participants then practiced transcribing sentences and listening to lectures delivered by L2 English speakers after they heard this explanation from Maxi-Ann. Finally, after all of this, they responded to 2 different scenarios about how they would approach a communication difficulty with a fictional international teaching assistant, Yusuf. After they finished the online portion, they then went to their class and participated in the in-class portion. This was led by Kris Acheson. Each section followed the same basic lesson plan presented here. The classes started with a group discussion generating a list of strategies they could use to better communicate with international teaching assistants. Then they were asked to imagine themselves as ITAs, participating in a sort of perspective-taking activity. Then they listened to Kris deliver a presentation on the difference between working against and working across linguistic difference. And that was used to set up the final activity where they were grouped together in groups that included both native and non-native speaking students. And they had to work together, imagining that they were working on a group project. And they had to come up with a list of strategies that they would use to make sure that communication was effective in their group. After they finished that discussion, they were asked to log in once more to the online system and complete the post-test and provide any other feedback that they might have. So I mentioned a pre-test and a post-test, and I'll describe that instrument really quickly. I created this based on my own ethnographic research, as reported in Subtirelu 2017. The instrument draws on the theory of planned behavior, which argues that collecting people's behavioral intentions is useful in that these can serve as a predictor of their future behavior. Participants were presented with a scenario about taking a class from a native Mandarin speaking instructor from China, and they then reported their intention to use various strategies on a 5-point scale. So here are a couple of the items from that. So item 10 reads, if you had questions about the instructions for a homework assignment that Dr. Chen gave, how likely would you be to ask a classmate instead of contacting him? And item 11 asks, how likely would you be to try to learn more about Dr. Chen's language and background on your own time so that you could communicate better with him? We used both statistical and qualitative forms of data analysis. The pre-test and post-test data was analyzed using a non-parametric within subjects comparison. And we also analyzed text-based data thematically and with particular attention to providing greater clarity about participants' intentions to use either collaboration or avoidance when communicating across linguistic differences. So here are some of the results. Here I've presented the items that were statistically significant in differences between pre and post test. This is for the collaboration set. So item 5 asks, if you didn't understand something from one of Dr. Chen's lectures, how likely would you be to raise your hand immediately and ask for clarification? And as you can see, we saw a shift towards participants being more willing to do that. And item 11 asks, how likely would you be to try to learn about Dr. Chen's language and background on your own time so that you could communicate better with him? And again, we saw a shift in that direction. Here similarly are the 2 avoidance items. These are sort of the mirror reflection of the other items. They're also statistically significant. Item 6 reads, if you didn't understand something from one of Dr. Chen's lectures, how likely would you be to remain quiet and let the problem pass? And the participants tended towards being less likely to do that. And item 12 reads, how likely would you be to assume that your knowledge of Dr. Chen's language and background is not important or is not your responsibility? And again, they shifted away from that idea. In both cases, the participants reported that they would be less likely to engage in avoidance of their non-native English speaking instructors after our intervention, and combined with the earlier results, they reported that they would be more likely to use collaboration strategies in the future. So as I mentioned before, we also used the qualitative data to try to provide greater insights into these behavioral intentions. Here I present 2 responses to one of the prompts about Yusuf, a fictional graduate student instructor from Egypt. In the scenario, Yusuf is explaining a mathematical proof to the whole class, but the student does not understand something he said. prompt asks the participant to say what they would do in this situation. Here I've given you two different responses that illustrate different levels of sensitivity to international teaching assistants and their potential anxieties about their Englishes. On the left, we have a relatively more naive view. Here the student does not show a lot of awareness of the social complexities of dealing with communication difficulties in linguistically diverse spaces. Participant 142 wrote, "Ask for clarification or simply explain that you are finding it hard to understand him. He should not get offended because he must be aware of his own accent. As a result, he could explain the material once more, paying closer attention to his pronunciation and possibly speaking slower, thus solving the problem." We can see here that this participant doesn't seem to show much awareness that it's likely that Yusuf has quite a bit of anxiety about his own language. On the right, we have a relatively more informed view. Here the student raises concerns about how a question at the end of this explanation could be perceived and presents a strategy designed not to blame the non-native English-speaking instructor. So this participant wrote, "I could ask him to clarify on some of the bits of the proof that I did not understand. I personally hope that my mind did not go blank throughout the entire proof, so I would ask him to clarify specific portions that either I didn't understand due to his accent or because I truly did not get. Either way, I would just direct my question with the response that I did not understand the content to not insult or offend him." So we can see here that this participant shows greater awareness of the possibility that their attempt at repair would be perceived negatively by the non-native speaking international teaching assistant. So overall, we found that the 174 domestic students that we had complete data for showed changes in the desired direction for the pre to the post tests. Specifically, they reported stronger intentions to use collaboration strategies and weaker intentions to use avoidance strategies. We're cautiously optimistic about the success of this intervention in terms of encouraging participants to use more productive communication strategies to deal with communication problems in their classes. However, we do acknowledge the need for a more nuanced interpretation that recognizes that many of the participants have not fully worked through the social complexities of addressing communication difficulties in linguistically diverse spaces, such as participant 142 from my last slide. In general, it appears that greater attention to the anxieties that non-native English speakers often have about communicating with native English speakers would be useful for our intervention. So to wrap up my talk, I believe that recognizing and challenging privilege is essential to social justice work, and that this is especially true for those of us who benefit from such privilege. We don't commonly talk about language privilege, but I would argue that it has important consequences for communication across linguistic difference, which is a central concept in applied linguistics. Although it is also important to note that language privilege is tightly connected to other forms of privilege, especially whiteness. So there's a small but growing literature in applied linguistics that attempts to challenge the general trend toward focusing on what the non-native speaker can do better. But we still need quite a bit more work in this area, as well as broader imagining of other ways in which our scholarship could challenge native English speakers' privilege in our field and in our day-to-day lives. And I hope to see much more of this kind of work in the future. And I hope that some of you graduate students who are listening right now will be the ones to go ahead and do this for us. So I'm gonna really quickly show you some of my references. And then I will thank you for listening to my talk, and a special thanks to the graduate students who have organized this, as well as No Code for inviting me as well. So thank you all, and I am happy to take questions.